Hello and welcome to this discussion on welfare. This is one of a series of programs that we're doing at IPFW on a variety of issues and how they're addressed in different countries. For example, we're going to be talking about education, we're going to talk about welfare, we're going to talk about the military even. And to do this today, we have a wonderful panel of guests. We have from the Department of International Language and Culture Studies, Assistant Professor of Spanish, Talia Bugle. We also have from the Department of Political Science, Associate Professor James Toole. And then from the Department of History, we have Assistant Professor Ann Livshiz. And then finally, rounding out our crew is future faculty fellow member of the Department of History, Xin Fan. This event is being brought to you by the Departments of History and Political Science here at IPFW, as well as the American Democracy Project and the Mike Downs Center for Indiana Politics. I want to get right into things. I know that people have an idea in their head of what a welfare program is, but let's go back about 100 years. Let's go back, say, to the late 1800s, early 1900s. What would people have thought of as a welfare program at that time? Ann?
Well, when we're talking about welfare programs, the 19th century is a really interesting place to start because it's really a period of transition. In particular, 19th century Europe, a period of transition. We still have traditional local poor relief, stuff that sort of local communities dealing with problems within their communities with their own resources, but we also see the development of modern centralized state intervention to help deal with various problems. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of some very important developments. The evolution in the nature of the relationship between the state and the people, the evolution in dominant political ideologies, and discussions about what is the source of poverty, what is this, whether it's something that really needs to be addressed at the state level. And so, for the most part, in the 19th century, the effort really is to try to combat various social problems, and in particular, of course, in particular poverty, while at the same time making sure that the poor people don't get too comfortable, with all of this help that the government is slowly deciding to perhaps dole out to those it deems deserving.
Mm-hmm. Xin, what were things like in China about 100 years or so ago?
To answer this question, I think in the beginning I have to clarify several things. First, the very term social welfare does not exist in traditional Chinese literature. So that means at that time there was no such idea of social welfare back in China. However, if you look at the turn of 19th century, that's a time of dramatic change in China. So some foreign ideas, such as social welfare, were began to introduce into China. Before that, we have this traditional China. Because China has a very long history and it's a very complicated society, so we certainly can identify several things which were quite similar to today's social welfare in traditional China. For example, when natural disaster occurred, the Chinese government would intervene, would provide assistance for its civilians when it's necessary. At the same time, when something happened to a family, the family network will also provide help. So that's the case for China.
Very good. Talia, anything sort of unique about South America in this time period we're talking about, late 1800s, early 1900s?
Yes, I think that I can talk about Uruguay specifically, and I can see at the end of the 19th century how the state was starting to pick up some of the traditional activities of the church, for example, regarding education. In 1874, the education became compulsory and free in Uruguay, and that was a clear move of taking that out of the hands of the church and into the care of the state.
Mm-hmm. So we actually see some commonalities there in that the state is starting to exert a little more effort in this area. Let's move forward about 50 years now. So mid-1900s, had much evolved by then, Ann?
Well, if the 19th century was an interesting time, the first half of the 20th century is even more interesting because you have the continued evolution of 19th century political ideologies, but also the creation of brand new ones that go from being ideologies and theories into becoming practical political platforms implemented in countries like Bolshevik Russia, Nazi Germany, and fascist Italy. You also have the Great Depression, which affected everybody except for the Soviet Union. And as a result of the Great Depression, that also leads to the reconceptualization in the role that the state should play in making sure that that everybody in society is taken care of, at least at some basic minimal level.
And Shin, you said that China was really starting to take part in some of these ideas. 50 years later, how much had things changed?
The fundamental change regarding social welfare system in China would be the increasing involvement of the socialist state in people's private life. This is one of the fundamental themes in the history of China during the 20th century. So previously, in traditional China, the state would keep a minimum role in people's life. So the state only provided help when it was necessary. But after the establishment of the People's Republic of China, which is the Communist China, you can see the state gradually began to take control of people's private life by establishing certain kind of systems. One interesting system would be the work unit system. So basically, the work unit system is based on this very idea that people would work, live, and study and transform in the same social economic cell. And this social economic cell would provide the fundamental needs of the socialist citizens. So this is the situation in China. The state began to control people's private life by doing this work unit system.
And this is not dissimilar from what was happening in the Soviet
Right,
Union.
and I would even say that it's not just the Soviet Union, but I think more generally we can see that this is part of that evolution of the relationship between the state and the people, the perception of the role of the state, where it goes from the state shouldn't be involved at all to perhaps occasionally under close supervision the state should be involved to the state should be involved and do some good. And then of course the next step is going to be the state must be involved and must transform, must interfere as much as possible in order to do what, to create a better society according to the definition that the state provides. And the Soviet Union is an extreme example of that. China is as well. But this is a trend that we see in other European countries as well.
But the term social welfare still did not exist in China and did not exist in the Soviet Union by that by most people's conception of the term.
Yeah.
Talia, post-World War II in Uruguay, things were they were pretty good there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, certainly, because both Uruguay and Argentina were providers of grains and meat to Europe during World War II. So the economic situation there was very good. So we still had everything that had started to be implemented at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century. The 8-hour labor law, retirement, pensions, and free health, free university, all things that followed that first move of free schooling. So there weren't any major changes.
Anne?
I just wanted to say, it's interesting that the Uruguay example is that it's a prosperity that leads the way towards these programs, whereas, for example, in the case of Western Europe, in the aftermath of World War II, it's actually the lack of prosperity that leads in the same general direction, where the devastation, kind of the combination of the devastation of the war and the creation, kind of the appearance of so many more people who needed assistance, it combined with the fact that you have, as a result of political changes during the war and various collaborationist policies on the part of right-wing political parties, the emergence of the left as the loyal patriots who now, at least briefly after World War II in Western Europe, are in a position to formulate policy, that we see the passing of a lot of social legislature, in many cases that remains in place even after the left sort of loses its positions of power. In some cases, like Britain, it's not until Margaret Thatcher in the 80s that some of these programs established after World War II end up getting dismantled. So the same result, a lot of promotion of healthcare and so on, but for reasons of poverty rather than prosperity.
Now, on our way over here to the CATV studios, and I should mention that we like to thank CATV for recording these for us and broadcasting them, as well as MDON for making them available on the internet. But on the way over here, Jamie and I were having a discussion about definitions. So if we were to define welfare today, how would we define it?
Well, a lot of people think of welfare programs, of course, as serving lower-income people only. And social welfare programs really do much more than that, and many of them, in fact, benefit people who are not lower income, but actually are middle income or even upper income. In fact, when you look at the U.S. federal budget, what you find is that we spend more, essentially, if you take all these programs together, we spend more on the middle and on programs that benefit everyone than we do on programs that benefit only people at the lower income levels. So when we talk about social welfare these days in this country, we're talking about all of the social spending programs that benefit individual people.
But we could actually differentiate. We could talk about those programs
That's right.
specifically to those who were needy.
That's right.
And those that benefit all of us, whether we're needy or not.
That's right. So we can make that distinction, and that's an important one. We can also distinguish programs according to whether we as individual people contribute to them or not. And as almost all of our views, I'm sure, are aware, we get money taken out of our paychecks for Social Security and Medicare, and those are of course, the two premier and also most popular programs in this country that are social welfare programs. Those are, of course, contributory programs. Other programs don't require a contribution, and in fact are paid out in benefits from the government to individuals based on need or some other criterion.
And so when we call those means tested. So if you
That's
are
right.
applying for food stamps, for example, you have to prove that you meet the income guidelines.
That's
if
right.
you're applying for a housing voucher, same thing.
Exactly.
And those you only get if you meet those the tests.
That's right, and they can be revoked from you if you end up having a higher income than, say, you used to have.
Sure. Anyone else want to chime in on today's definition of welfare? Okay.
In China today, people use 社会福利 to translate social welfare into Chinese. Roughly, this term means happiness and the benefits provided by society. For the communist leaders, they tend to conceptualize this idea of social welfare from two directions. Actually, it's quite similar to what you have been discussing here. One is the general well-being of people. So the general terms. And the second one is assistance for certain underprivileged groups of people in the society. So for example, for those people who lost their jobs, for those people, they are peasant workers, and for women. So that's the situation, the definition of social welfare in China today.
We've actually sort of begun to delve into this idea of ideology. And so, Jamie, let's talk a little bit about different ideologies and why a society may or may not want to provide social welfare. We have great examples of wealthy and poor countries deciding to do that. So,
Well, two of the great ideologies the last 50, 60 years, and of course going much farther back, but we see the competition certainly most strongly in the Cold War, are between, of course, socialism on the one hand and what we broadly define as liberalism on the other, which is a commitment to liberties of all kinds, including, crucially for this discussion, free market liberties, economic liberties that allow people to run their economic lives as free as possible from undue governmental control. And of course, these two ideologies have very different perspectives on social welfare. From the liberal free market point of view, which of course is what you find in the United States, there's an assumption that government can step in to help out when the need is great, but it's not obligated to. If it can, it will do so as a policy option, but there's no sort of necessary moral obligation there. And so in free market countries like the United States, we tend to have social welfare systems that are relatively minimal. On the other hand, of course, socialism has a strong interest in providing equality, as much economic equality as possible to its to its citizens. So whereas liberalism focuses on the freedom to do what you want to do economically, socialism focuses on, as much as possible, a greater equality of economic outcome. And so socialism, of course, views government programs like this as a necessary means to the end of creating greater economic equality. And of course, the farther you go left on the socialist scale, the more the commitment will be to have government provide, near or almost total equality. And the more mild on the socialist end, we see still a strong commitment to these kinds of programs, but also with some allowance for the free market.
So, Anne, in the Soviet Union, there were no welfare programs, were there?
I know this is that moment when I get to disagree with Jamie. I mean, it's very interesting because I think in some ways, and of course, this is not perhaps the panel to discuss the definition of communism and, whether, and socialism in excruciating detail, but it is interesting that when we look at the Soviet Union, which was supposed to be building socialism and then eventually building communism, we actually don't really see too much emphasis on providing the way Jamie phrased it, the egalitarianism was not really a desired outcome. There was some lip service paid to it early on, but that really disappeared by the early 1930s. And it's interesting that as long as Stalin was alive, the Soviet Union was not a welfare state in the way that we imagine it. Certainly, there were various programs provided by the state because, frankly, the state was the sole provider of everything, right? Which means there was state-provided healthcare, there was state-provided education, which we'll talk more on another panel. But once you actually start to look at the implementation, we don't really see the state being particularly generous, doling out these various benefits. There's far less an interest in the safety net aspect of welfare programs. There's free healthcare, but access to healthcare is limited depending on what region of the country you live in, whether you live in an urban area or a rural area. And what it ultimately comes down to is that the state, in some ways, Stalin was perhaps one of the greatest opponents of the welfare state, of that model that the state will provide everything for you and people should just expect it. There was this constant obsession in the Soviet Union, as long as Stalin was alive, with we should not just be giving things away to people. People should be working for whatever they're getting. The pensions. There were no pensions, for example, for people who worked on collective farms. You work until you drop dead, basically. Or if you're lucky enough to have a child who has moved to the urban areas where there are some kind of broader, provisions, then maybe they can help take care of you. But that mentality that we can't allow for the existence of free riders, there was tremendous amount of emphasis placed on rooting out the free riders in the Soviet Union as long as Stalin was alive.
And we actually, in policy classes, we spend a lot of time talking about the free rider problem because that's the problem. How do you get everybody to contribute to a program from which they all benefit? So it's something that we do discuss in great detail, you might say. Talia, I'm kind of curious, what was the ideological basis or why these things that had been provided by church or by religious groups, why were they suddenly provided by government in Uruguay?
When Uruguay was independent and as it developed as a new country in the second half of the 19th century, there were basically two political parties that one was more representative of the landowners, and they were mostly from Spanish origin. They were the descendants of the first people who came to Uruguay. And the other party, which was called the Red Party, but had nothing to do with communism.
Not to be confused with other parties discussed later on.
Ended up receiving the other immigrants, the workers, the people from Eastern Europe, and from Italy, and that gave it the basic, if you want, kind of socialist part without being socialist. And also there were many anarchists immigrating from Spain and Italy, both to Uruguay and Argentina, and then they couldn't stay in Argentina and they came to Uruguay. All those were very, very big influences, both in starting the unions and in making progress towards all these rights.
Mm-hmm. So there's a fairly heavy European influence.
Yes.
Are there other distinctions as far as Europe is concerned that I'll look at the two people who spend some time studying there. Are there other distinctions that we really should be thinking about between either the United States and Europe, Europe and other places? Anything else that we might want to be thinking about here?
Well, I think there's some clear distinctions between Europe and the United States. And in Europe, there's a greater expectation that the state will step in with social programs that will, allow people to live their lives more easily. Of course, it's very common in most European countries to have education be free or nearly free through the university level. Now, that's all starting to change, for example, under the pressures of recent years. And, for example, there are a lot of big controversies right now in Britain over how much students should be paying for university, and British students are paying much more in university tuition than they ever did before. But that's just one example. Another is healthcare, of course. In just about every other advanced industrial democracy, universal healthcare is guaranteed. These are in the rich democracies of the rich world, overwhelmingly in Europe. And so in most other wealthy countries, there's an expectation that the government will play a much bigger role in providing social welfare to people. And of course, in the United States, given our free market inclinations, we, of course, tolerate far less governmental involvement.
So what's the purpose of these social welfare programs? Or why do we have them? Of course, we could guess it's a nice altruistic reason to make life better for people, but Anne, why do we have social welfare programs?
Well, now that you've mocked the altruistic explanation, I'm going to start with a modified version of the altruistic explanation. And I'll use a word that should be near and dear to your heart, voting. I think one of the big things, one of the big reasons why we see, especially in the 19th century, and this is certainly why the 19th century is so crucial for this, is that with the expansion of the franchise and the fact that more people from different socioeconomic groups, more men from different socioeconomic groups are able to vote, it means that it changes the nature of the kinds of questions that are being put on the agenda for government officials, right? If they want to get elected, if they want to get the votes of the workers, in the end, you may scoff at the idea that workers can vote, but that vote is still, well, in most cases, almost the same as somebody else's. Sometimes there are different proportions, but still, it's still a valuable thing to have. Then you're going to have to consider things that are of interest to these kinds of groups. And so I think maybe it's not altruistic because I think governments in general, do very few things for purely altruistic reasons, but it's survival. If we're going to consider these various groups of people to be citizens, then we have to consider what is of concern to them and deal with that in some kind of way. Less altruistically, perhaps, and again, especially talking about the Soviet Union, certainly the questions of if you're saying that you're building a brand new society, the best society in the world. There's a level of expectation from the 19th century that the best societies are going to be providing for their citizens in some way. So the Soviet Union also had universal health care guarantee. Now, granted, they were much better at things like and to give them, I don't often say that, but to give them credit, they were reasonably good at dealing with things like vaccinations and preventative measures, in part because they knew that they simply did not have the resources to do. if something went out of control, there would just simply not be the resources to do so. So mandatory vaccinations, and various other low-level, low-tech provisions did help, protect the health of many, many, many people.
But I think maybe we also should bring this back to the broad perspective. I think, Anne, you're making some really interesting points about how the motives that we normally ascribe to communist governments are not really, what we expect them to be. But we do need to remember, I think, that in the end, these were societies, looking at the Soviet Union, for example, societies in which there was no private enterprise at all. The state did provide everything. So to the extent there was health care, the state provided it. To the extent there was housing, the state provided it. To the extent there were all of these things that we normally consider being part of social welfare programs, the state provided it, which is why we need to remember that socialism and, in the extreme, communism are ideologies that definitely do say government has to step in to support people because there is nothing else when you get at least to the extreme and go to communism. And when we're talking about socialism or milder forms, social democracy, etc., then there's much more tolerance for the free market.
Shin?
I think I would like to jump into this debate because oftentimes it is not the socialist socialist state who spoke to you. In China's case, actually, it was the work unit. We probably can define China as a socialist country from 1949 to 1978. At that time, as I mentioned, that the Chinese government established a well-arranged work unit system. And for the most typical case would be the state-owned enterprises. Okay, so if you were a worker in a state-owned enterprise, you will guarantee for a lifelong membership. So in China, there's an idea called iron rice bowl. That means you got a job, you won't worry about your life forever. So basically, the work unit would provide you free healthcare, free education for next generation, and lower cost of housing. So basically everything. So that's probably for people in China, people would consider the work unit is the socialist unit, is the socialist life. Back to the question about the goals and the purpose of social welfare programs in China, I would think the party leaders would consider social welfare programs as tools to achieve three goals in Chinese society. First is to increase economic productivity, because when you guarantee everything for the workers, the Chinese leaders would assume the workers will work really hard. The second idea is to maintain social stability, which is fundamentally important for a socialist state, because the state has everything. It is controlling everything, then you must give something to the people. And the last one is to enhance the legitimacy of the socialist state. And there's a long entrenched idea in Chinese culture, which is, we can call this idea as grand unity. So for such a grand unity, that is, the world is shared by all alike, which is actually quite similar to communist ideology.
Sorry, I'm so glad that that Jim brought up the question of political legitimacy, because the one more thing that I wanted to add as far as Soviet motivations is buying loyalty, which I guess is a slightly less fancy way of saying political legitimacy, but I really mean it as buying loyalty, and this primarily happens after the death of Stalin. As long as Stalin is alive, there's very little of doling out. I mean, I think that Jamie's point is a very important one. Certainly, there's going to be nothing else coming in if the state is not providing it. But the state was just very, very careful with its money and its resources. There wasn't the sense. I mean, if you were going to get something, you had to really, really work for it, and not in advance. First, you work for it, then you get something. After Stalin's death, there's really a lot more effort into buying people's loyalty, and that's where we really see the development of the Soviet Union as a welfare state. And while it could never really match up the kinds of provisions that Western democracies could do, there's really a lot of effort to do so. And we're talking about various benefits and vacations provided through trade unions and building housing. I mean, all of these different things as a way to say, see, we can provide you with all of these things in an effort to make sure that people continue to work and exist without threatening the fundamental structure of the political system.
Jamie, do you have something else to add?
Yeah, I wanted to say one more thing about the goals and purposes, and this follows on what Anne said about altruistic and non-altruistic purposes, and I'm in complete agreement with that, and I just wanted to broaden it out even farther and say, some people make the argument that free market capitalism needs the welfare state in order to survive, because the free market generates tremendous economic inequalities. There are a lot of great things about the free market. It's tremendously creative, it's enormously productive, there are all sorts of incentives to work hard and create new things, and that's all wonderful. But the downside of the free market is that it generates lots of inequalities. It creates big division between the rich and the poor. And so many people have argued that the free market paradoxically actually needs some level of the welfare state in order to prevent people from being outraged at too much inequality. So it provides people with, at least in this country, at least just enough social welfare to be happy with the system, and to believe that that welfare may allow them to get a leg up and perhaps eventually take advantage of all the energy that the free market can provide and make them wealthier, et cetera.
Now, it's interesting, Talia, you said that in the case of Uruguay, they were fairly wealthy after World War II. Things moved along pretty well. that at the turn of the century, they were not doing too badly. They implemented programs for what would seem to be the altruistic reasons. But there's been an economic downturn in the 1980s, another one again this decade. What can you say the purpose of the social welfare program is today in Uruguay? Is it the same as it was, and simply with less money they can do less with it?
I would say yes, that is the case. With less money, they can do less, and this has produced a migration of the middle classes going to have their education and their health needs provided by private, in paying extra for that. I remember that when in my parents' generation, everyone went to the public school, to that one that was created in 1874, but in my generation, when the dictatorship was on, we started migrating to the private schools. And today, with the lack of resources, public education is really, really bad, and you see most middle-class people will send their children to private schools. The same with health. When I was growing up, I remember that we did have private health, and the idea that the way it was explained to me was that, yes, we all pay for public health, but we can pay our private care. So we're not going to be using the resources, the public resources that need to be spent with the people who can't afford the private. Today, the explanation is very different. Like, a lot of people are worried about leaving their health care or their education into the hands of the state because of the lack of resources. After in the 1990s, actually, some private universities started to open, which was very new for us.
Now, we have been talking about something that is a large part of every country's budget, no matter what terminology we use to describe it. And we do have a couple of graphics that will be coming up in just a second here. One of them shows the 10 countries that have the lowest per capita or percentage of GDP expenditures on social programs, and the other shows the top 10. Jamie, why don't you take us through these graphics a little bit, if you would, please?
Okay, sounds good. I'm not sure which one we have first. We'll start with the lowest, yeah?
Yep.
Okay, so first, what do we have here? We have total public social expenditure as a percentage of GDP. GDP, a rough average of the wealth of an economy. The total value of all goods and services produced in a given year. And there are 34 countries in this data set, and we have the 10 lowest here. And from lowest to about 1/3 up the list. And we see the United States there at number 10. So of the 34 countries, which are the wealthiest countries in the world in general, we see the United States at about 1/3 the way up from the bottom. So a relatively small welfare state,
and below the average.
And below the average. We see on the last line there the OECD, which collects this data, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, averages 19.3. So we're a bit below average. And that's not surprising, again, given our free market inclinations, right? So, but that's still a sizable chunk of our total GDP. That 16% of GDP goes into social welfare spending, and this includes everything from old age benefits, survivors benefits, to health, housing, and unemployment, et cetera. All the things that we wrap up into this, into social welfare spending.
So if we take a look at the top 10 now,
right? We
see a slightly different story.
We do. We see a slightly different story. We see France at the top with 28.4, and you might note that every country in the top 10 here is in Europe. In fact, all of them are traditionally West European countries. In other words, except for the one, Hungary, at position number 9. So, and this shouldn't surprise us either. We know that European countries in general tend to spend more on social programs. And this puts the United States into perspective. We're at 16%, and this list tops out at 28%.
So Let's talk a little bit about the variety of programs that are offered today. You pointed out that these figures roll together a lot of the things, and we've done this all program long. We keep rolling off, education or housing, et cetera, et cetera. So let's talk for a second about how broad the spectrum is today. Obviously, the Soviet Union's no longer around, Anne, but Russia still is.
Russia still is. I mean, the really interesting thing, and I know that for most, up till now, I kept saying, well, the Soviet Union didn't have a welfare program, didn't have one. I mean, you really, in the 60s, late 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, I mean, you really see the development of a welfare state in the Soviet Union. The really interesting thing, I think, is the fact that a lot of the, in addition to the effort to buy loyalty, there's also a competition factor. That is because Western Europe is promoting these policies, the Soviet Union has to step up. I mean, it's interesting that, you know, if in Europe the idea is if we promote these programs, there won't be a bloody violent revolution that will bring communists to power. In the Soviet Union, they are playing catch up. You know. They're playing catch-up with Western Europe, and ultimately, they can't match Western Europe. They simply do not have, leaving aside the motivations and desires, they simply do not have the resources to be able to do so. In the 70s, the Soviet Union's percentage of GDP is lower than the United States, not by a lot, but it's still, but it's still lower. When the Soviet Union collapses, I mean, Russia inherits a significant chunk of their population with the expectation, with that set of expectations. And it's interesting that regardless of how people may have felt about communism, communists, the communist government, and so on, there's still the expectation on the part of the majority of the population that the state is supposed to be taking care of certain things. Even though now there is a market, even though now there are private enterprises that can provide, health, health and so on, there's still the idea that the state is responsible for taking care of these programs. And this was really sort of a big challenge, a transition challenge for Russia and various other post-Soviet republics, how to cope with the new budgetary constraints and issues while at the same time trying to maintain the legitimacy of these new governments if they were going to be rolling back on the programs that people came to expect from their governments.
Shin, obviously China's in transition right now. What kind of scope of programs are we looking at today?
If you look at the number, China today actually is spending something like 14% of its GDP on social welfare programs, which is actually lesser than US one. But if we go back to this very idea, the social welfare system in China, in the communist China, was hinged on this work unit system. By 1978, almost 98% of Chinese workers were in the system, in the work unit system. So basically, those people were able to get access to free healthcare, the big social program in China. However, during the last 2 decades, especially after 1995, the Chinese government is conducting a radical reform to change the old work unit system. Nearly 40% of Chinese workers who are working in the state-owned enterprises lost their job. So that means today the number in China for the people who are enjoying the social welfare programs actually has declined dramatically. It has been a big problem for Chinese society now.
Talia, earlier you had mentioned, before we went on the air, you had mentioned a program where families were actually given money for their children. This was not a tax deduction. Can you describe the program?
Yes, it is related to this education being compulsory. You have to send your children to elementary school and middle and high school, and as a way to make sure that your kids have everything they need to go to school, from pencils and a good breakfast and all those things. Each families receive money for each child they have.
And this is just a cash payment?
Yes, that you receive every month. Until your children are 18, and all families receive. My family received them. Everyone. So it's one of the things that are not for the needy. It's to make sure that you send your child to to school.
And obviously sometimes programs that might get called welfare programs or social welfare programs in the broadest sense possible are trying to encourage a particular type of behavior. And so here in the States, for example, people who are watching, if they've done their taxes recently, they may have actually deducted the interest from the mortgage that they have on their taxes. And if you look across the country, it's like well over $100 billion is actually not collected by the government because people take this deduction, which is an interesting dynamic. It's different when people see money going out versus not collecting it. Jamie, do you have any, why are we so willing to accept not collecting revenue versus paying revenue out?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's just, there's a deep-seated, of course, American skepticism toward government. And that's true for lots of reasons. And perhaps it's just that if the money never really touches governmental hands, then it seems more legitimate to a lot of Americans. And it certainly keeps money at home in your own pocket. And, it accords with the deep American sense that money is best spent by individual people. And maybe that's why.
Well, and it's money that's not getting paid out. It was just not collected.
That's right. It never went through and back out.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about corporate welfare, the last kind of welfare, since we've touched a little bit on welfare programs for those who are needy. We've talked a little bit about programs for providing for everybody. Let's talk about corporate welfare. In the case of the Soviet Union, we don't really have corporate welfare since the state owns everything.
It's sort of corporate welfare because it means that the state's interests when it comes to industry and corporations can be honored. Mm-hmm. It's a better example probably is places like Nazi Germany or fascist Italy, where you have an authoritarian regime where the state wants to play a very important role in the economy while simultaneously allowing private enterprise to continue. And so certainly their corporations would be tremendous beneficiaries of the variety of programs that the regime is putting forward. And again, in the case of both Germany and Italy during that time, these are both the ideologies that helped bring Hitler and Mussolini, or in chronological order, Mussolini and Hitler respectively to power. They had a strong socialist dimension to them, at least in the eyes of some of their early followers. And this is one of the big things that happens is kind of the, coming to terms with big businesses. The big businesses help support these parties. They help promote order and stability. And in exchange, the government makes sure that they're able to have cheap labor or free labor in the case of Nazi Germany during World War II. And various other benefits. They never have to worry about workers going on strike. They never have to worry about unions, having some kind of adversarial relationship. And in exchange, it's a mutually beneficial relationship for the regime.
We see an ever-expanding private sector, or what we would call private sector in China. How does the government support that private enterprise?
This is a very interesting question because in China, basically, scholars have been saying there's a social contract between people and the government. The government would control over political issues. The government would not allow free speech. At the same time, the government needs to keep a promise that the Chinese economy will continue to grow, at least at something like 7% each year. So in that case, the Chinese government actually does not put a lot of responsibilities or control over the private sector. And another thing is, in today's China, the private sector is composed by small business. So some people even call this bamboo capitalism. It's like a small bamboos. They are tiny, small, so there's very little governmental control over those tiny, small businesses. So it's probably an interesting point to see.
Go ahead, Anne.
Well, actually, can I go back for a second to Talia's earlier point about subsidies for families?
No. Yes, go ahead.
It's interesting because I think that more generally, we see, it's interesting that as an example for a kind of program that we support in the United States to fulfill social goals would be house ownership in places like the Soviet Union and Russia. Russia today, you have a very strong pronatalism bent to social policies that, they don't necessarily pay out all children, but certainly they do if you have initially more than 4 or 5 or 6. Now it's just more than 1 or 2. They're ready to pay. I mean, there's kind of this sense of crisis, demographic crisis, and so there's the government are trying to be very generous. They're providing financial. Just kind of cash up front, privileged housing arrangements. I mean, all of these things in order to get people to behave, to behave a certain way. If we go back to the Soviet period, I mean, we see policy, more general pernatalist policies, where even though there's no cash being handed out, again, the Soviet regime was very careful about not handing cash out up front. But you do have certain policies, for example, protective legislation for women. I mean, you have very generous, maternity leaves before, during, after. You have, there's guarantee that the women with small children won't lose their jobs. I mean, all of this is all paid for by society more generally. But the idea is that this is worth the effort because it fulfills the greater needs of the country, namely population growth and future taxpayers.
Because we always need future taxpayers.
Or work bills of socialism. Sorry.
So do the type, breadth, or scope of the welfare programs that are offered within a country influence the way other countries want to interact with it? Talia, let's start with you this time. Do you think that there is, when Uruguay is dealing in international relations, do they take into consideration what the other country does in terms of welfare programs?
I do know that when Uruguay entered a common market agreement with Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay in 1991, one of the concerns in Uruguay were that some of those other countries didn't have the same level of protection in terms of labor rights and unemployment and all those rights that workers have in Uruguay. So yes, that I think that is a specific example in which coming together in an economic agreement with your neighbors raises concerns about, well, if we're going to all be the same, how are we going to, that person over there doesn't have the free health or the free education or the unemployment or the right to strike. Mm-hmm. So how are we going to work with that?
And I would think that fear actually goes both ways, and that the countries that don't offer those programs think that perhaps people will suddenly want them. Those that do offer them are concerned that people will come from the other country and suddenly want to take part in those programs as well. Xin, does China take a look at what anyone's doing when it's making international relations decisions?
Yes, of course, China actually is learning a lot from Western countries. China has been trying to build up a comprehensive welfare system, although at this moment it's not very successful. But I will try to answer the question in another way, because people today are saying that the Chinese government keeps the Chinese currency artificially low, so China actually can sell a lot to the United States. I'm not sure if this is true, but the question is, why does China want to sell a lot to the United States? Then the question is, China at this moment actually has a relatively small domestic market. If you compare with numbers, at this moment, the Chinese domestic consumption only makes up something like 35% of its GDP, in contrast to 90%, to 70% of the United States one. So China has a small domestic market. Why? Because Chinese people are saving a lot. Why Chinese people are saving a lot? Because at this moment, the social welfare reforms in China has not been successful. So people actually have a real concern about their lives. They put a lot of money into saving. It turns out at this moment, the Chinese saving rate of overall GDP is more than 40%.
That's a lot of money saved.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah, but if you don't think the government's going to provide you with programs, then you have to be prepared to take care of yourself.
Right. Use one example. According to a 2006 national survey, something like 50% of Chinese population cannot afford money to go to hospital.
Wow.
That's half the population.
Wow. And obviously welfare programs played a role in the Cold War. Describe a little bit how that played out.
Well, I think, I mean, one big way is that it became, sort of welfare became one of the battle zones of the Cold War. It was crucial for the Soviet Union to show that it was only their unique political system that was going to be able to provide those kinds of advantages to its people. It was crucial for the West to show that one didn't need to go over to the dark side in order for its citizens, for their citizens to be able to enjoy a lot of those benefits. So there's that competition. And again, like I think I said earlier, it's interesting that it was driven by the West primarily, that the Soviet Union simply was the fear of the Soviet Union's success in the welfare front drove the West's desire to improve their programs, which in turn forced the Soviet Union to keep up, which they simply could not afford to do.
Well, the question we always close these discussions with is fairly simple. What sort of insight or conclusions do you draw about governments, culture, societies in general from your understanding of welfare? And we do have to be kind of short here, so Talia, let's start with you. What kind of conclusions do you draw about your understandings of a country based on the knowledge that you have of their welfare system? Or we could actually start with Jamie, we'll come back to Talia.
Well, I think one way to look at this is to simply say that it tells you two things. One, it tells you how wealthy the country is, and two, it tells you how generous the country is and how it wants to treat the least, within its the people with the lowest incomes, right? Within the society. Now, generosity can be measured in different ways. For example, in the United States, we tend to have very small government, as we showed in the figures here, in terms of social welfare spending. However, we give much more in private giving. And to some degree, that makes up some of the balance. So we have to be careful when we talk about generosity, but there's no doubt that a country that a society willing to be taxed higher and have that money paid out in benefits, many of which will go to people who are not in your income class, is a society that has made a more generous decision. It also, of course, depends on how wealthy the country is. If you don't have the money, you can't do these programs, or you're limited.
Shin?
Yeah, I'm going to take another perspective. The conclusion I can draw from this conversation is today the world is globalizing. So it's nothing only domestic. For example, I'm talking about China, but the very issue of social welfare system in China actually affects the relationship between China and the United States. So probably we need to have a broader view over the issue of social welfare systems today, and probably we should have a broader view of the world.
Mm-hmm. Anne?
Well, since Jamie took what I wanted to say, the welfare state is the measure of prosperity and humanity of any given society, I would just add two very quick things. One, I think part of the discussion, the fact that we're able to cover such a wide chronological time period, is that it comes down to the question of where does poverty come from? If it's something, is it something that happens to people because it's their fault, and if so, then nobody has the responsibility to help them, or whether this is a result of social patterns that then the society does need to address in some kind of meaningful way. And then the second part is sort of the way that the word welfare, and more broadly welfare state, has become one of those words that people have kind of a very visceral reaction to without realizing some of the points that Jamie made, for example, the fact that welfare programs are not just for the poor. In fact, they benefit lots of other people. And again, the broader question, I mean, what does it mean for a society when it is or isn't willing to take care of those who cannot help themselves?
And Talia?
Yes, I realized by listening to everyone how it does depend on the time and the place and how it is that people came to be in need. As you mentioned before, Uruguay was a very prosperous society until the 60s or the 70s, and then there was a 15-year dictatorship that left the country with a huge foreign debt and with very, very large differences between the upper class and the lower class. And Uruguay had been up to then a country with a very large middle class. So for sure, by now, with the lack of resources, with the economic crisis, all the welfare has to be readjusted.
Well, I want to thank all of you for being here. I do appreciate it. Joining us today were Talia Bugle from International Language and Culture Studies, Jamie Toole from Political Science, and Liv Shiz from History, and also Xin Fan from History. This was a discussion on welfare. It's part of a series that we're doing on a variety of issues and how they're handled in countries around the world. We hope that you've enjoyed it. It was brought to you by the Departments of History and Political Science at IPFW, as well as the American Democracy Project and Mike Downs Center for Indiana Politics. And thanks, as always, to CATV for recording it. You can see it there as well as on MDON. Thank you very much for joining us.